So my name's Tanvi Nagpal, and I think all of you know me, but for those who don't, I am the director of the International Development Program at SAIS. And that's all I'm going to say about myself. And to my right is Chloe Hauenstein. She's a second-year student in the International Development Program, also right here at SAIS. Chloe graduated from Claremont McKenna College and spent a year in India as a Fulbright grantee performing research on the interrelationship between informal and formal sectors in Delhi's solid waste management system. While she was at SAIS, she worked as a research assistant on a project that I will describe shortly. So she worked very closely with Matt and me. During the summer, Chloe interned for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and she will be returning there full-time after graduation to monitor financial trends across 12 of the largest banks in the system. So Chloe's going to speak to us today about her research on solidarity levies. Then to her right is Matt Eldridge, who is a policy program manager in the Research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute and the research products manager at Urban's Pay for Success initiative. His work focuses on pay for success and other forms of results-based financing and impact investing. Before joining Urban, Matt worked on aid effectiveness and portfolio management at the World Bank and on financial services regulatory issues for private sector clients. Matt has a BA from Virginia Tech and an MSc from the London School of Economics, both in international development. And to his right is Dr. Emily Gustafsson-Wright, who is a fellow in the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution, and she specializes in applied microeconomic research within the fields of education and health in developing countries. She's also a senior researcher with the Amsterdam Institute for International Development in the Netherlands. Emily's current work focuses on the challenges to scaling up early childhood development in developing countries, including looking at constraints around financing. And as part of this effort, she conducts research on innovative financing mechanisms for both health and education, including PPPs, social impact investing, results-based financing, and impact bonds. And Dr. Gustafsson has a PhD in economics from the Tinbergen Institute at the University of Amsterdam. And then to her right is Dr. Josh Michaud, who many of you also know because he teaches in the IDEF program, a class on global health policy. And he is the associate director with the global health policy team at the Kaiser Family Foundation, where he does research on many topics. But he is an authority on the role of the Department of Defense in global health, innovative financing, and global health diplomacy. He's published numerous articles and books and teaches at our program, of course. Josh holds a PhD in international health policy from Johns Hopkins SAIS, an MA in applied economics from Johns Hopkins, and an MHS in epidemiology from the Bloomberg School of Public Health. So we've got a pretty diverse set of speakers here, and I'm going to start us off in looking at 4 different models of raising money for the delivery of, for raising larger sources of donor money. We are going to be considering how they can be used for urban service delivery specifically, hopefully. So what we're going to do is the speakers will briefly speak for about, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes. And they're going to introduce a mechanism that has been used in a different sector to raise additional funds. In most cases, we're talking about non-repayable money, non-repayable finance. But in the case of, I guess, Emily's, and a little bit for advanced market commitments as well, we're going to also talk about repayable money. And today we're going to sort of focus on the sustainability of these sources. Is there something about the mechanism that also improves the way that the resources they raise are spent? Are these mechanisms particularly good at solving one type of problem but not another type of problem? And then how they can be scaled up. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chloe. And we're going to speak for a very short time, and then we're just going to talk. And we hope that you'll be able to ask a lot of questions in between. So this is really informal, and we hope that most of our students and all of our visitors will also join in this conversation. So I'm going to start, I guess. So this is, just to go back, this year I was part of a research project, SAIS as well as UrbanWise, that was funded by GIZ, the German Technical Cooperation Agency, and they wanted us to examine how we could raise donor financing, essentially non-repayable finance, to meet the SDGs, specifically SDG 6.1, which focuses on safe drinking water access. And the goal there is for safe drinking water access to all. That's the SDG goal. So we kind of looked, and what we found, we were looking at all kinds of financing flows, and the reality was that the infrastructure, just the infrastructure, not the service delivery, but just the infrastructure financing gap in developing countries per year is about 1 to 1.5 trillion. And if you look at the private sector participation in infrastructure financing over the last 4 years or 5 years, it's actually not been increasing. In fact, it's actually been declining. So while there's been a lot of enthusiasm from the World Bank and from the IFC and a lot of the multilateral development banks, reports calling billions to trillions, establishing independent private sector windows. The reality of the situation is that private sector participation in developing countries in the provision of infrastructure has been declining. And in service provision, it's been declining even more steeply. So this was sort of our idea going forward after we did a bunch of research. I'm not going to go through that, but the goal essentially is always for us to get to, in private sector provision, a sustainably financed utility that can provide services to everybody, including the poorest. However, where we are right now is at that first circle where there's a huge financing gap, which you can see in red. And the idea is that over time, we shrink that financing gap, which is currently financed by donors, and make utilities completely sustainably financed. This would be through commercial capital, taxes, as well as tariffs. So that's what a well-functioning utility essentially draws its money on. However, in between that very last circle and the big circle, there is a continuing need for donor financing. So the goal is, how do you fill that need, and how do you generate more money so that you can reach absolutely everybody, including the poorest, who are not going to be able to contribute enough taxes and tariffs in the next 5 to 10 years to be able to make those utilities sustainably finance worthy and attractive to the private sector, essentially. So what we did is we looked at 7 mechanisms to begin with: philanthropy-led global funds, global solidarity levies, land value capture, revolving funds, PPPs, impact investing through social enterprises, and the fund of funds model. And then through a series of conversations at various venues with people in the sector, including Louis, who is sitting right there. Thank you, Louis, for chatting with us over and over again about this. We kind of focused our attention on 3 things, on 3 mechanisms, I think. There were 3, right? Yes. Solidarity levies, fund of funds, or philanthropy-led global funds, and land value capture. And then we kind of combined them all and tried to create a model led by Matt. It was Matt's brainchild, and brought them all sort of together to see how do we combine different sources of funding and create incentives at the utility level for them to use those resources that we've just raised in a more effective pro-poor way. So that was our research, and we thought we would share it more widely with people, but also include others who've been talking about some of the other kinds of models that we were not able to reach or tackle in our project, in our particular research. So we're hoping we'll have a conversation with you over here. Our overarching objective there was to look at water, but clearly each one of us is going to reflect on other sectors as well today, and we're hoping that we'll be able to get some interesting dialogues going. So that's it. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Chloe, and she's going to tell you what she knows.
Thanks, Tanvi. So When we were thinking about how to sustainably finance water and service provision for water, one of the biggest issues that we kept facing is that capital expenditure is often taken care of. It's the big initial investment. It's a little bit easier to kind of advertise you're building a well or you're building pipes. But the bigger issue was maintaining that service delivery and making sure that the operational expenditures were continuing to be covered. So we started thinking about some sustainable ways to continue that financing. And I think that one of the most sustainable that we determined was the solidarity levy, which is a fairly straightforward concept. And it's just the idea that a group of countries come together with an issue in mind that they want to fund, and they figure out some sort of an industry, a good or a service, to impose a levy or a tax on, which is a very small levy, and so it doesn't impact the consumers that are buying that good or that service. And then pooling those funds from the levy in order to create kind of a long-term financing mechanism that's sustainable and can continue to finance over many years. So the model for this levy that we primarily looked at was, it's called Unitaid. It's a global organization, and they decided that the best levy for this was on the airline industry. So France was really the country that began this process. They initiated a $1 fee on coach flights within Europe and a $6 fee on international flights. And it's been able to raise billions of dollars. And so I listed some of the main benefits and considerations up here, which I'm happy to discuss more in depth in the Q&A period. But I think that the main idea is that you want an industry that's not going to be significantly negatively affected by this levy. You don't want to make the country less competitive by imposing this levy, as it is an optional it's a decision that a country can make in order to raise funds. And it really is kind of a long-term way to finance, because it's not affected by political cycles or economic fluctuations. So it really can just continue to fund the operational expenditures. And here I just have two diagrams from the Unitaid example. And so the diagram on the left kind of shows that although some of the other contributions that are going into this Unitaid Global Fund are diminishing, so the other contributions could just be like grants or donations from the Gates Foundation, for example, although those are kind of fluctuating over time and decreasing, the air tax has stayed relatively stable, which shows that it's kind of insulated from these political pressures, and that really is a model that could kind of offset a country that decides to decrease its aid provision or is going through a recession or something like that. And then the diagram on the right is just to show that Unitaid has been really good about incorporating different countries, including recipient government countries, as well as non-state actors like the Gates Foundation, which allows for kind of a more diversified pool of funds and allows recipient countries to be involved in the decision-making and the financing, which is ultimately more sustainable. And this is just to show the magnitude and the breadth of different types of industries that can be taxed. And I'm happy to go into these more in depth later, but for the sake of brevity, I'll hand it over to Matt.
Great, thank you, Chloe. So for mine, I only have one slide, sorry. So I'm gonna speak about land value capture, and land value capture is based on a very simple progression of logic, and it's tied to the bid-rent framework in spatial economics. So the first piece of logic is that if you invest in infrastructure, for instance, expand a public transit line and build a station, the land around that station or that investment will increase in value. So that's the first idea. That's in transit, that's a transit premium. In the US, it's estimated between a few percentage points to up to 150 percentage points of increase in land just by having that transit access right there. The second piece of logic is that when the land value goes up, the potential public revenue also goes up if the public is able to capture that revenue. Now, there's a lot of assumptions there, including the ability of the local authorities to be sophisticated enough to actually collect that that revenue, be transparent in how they use it and manage it. We'll get to those assumptions in a little bit, but assuming that that's the case and the public local government can capture that, public revenues can increase. And the third piece of assumption is that if those revenues have increased and they're able to capture that revenue increase, they're able to either reinvest that in that particular community for more infrastructure investments, or they can redistribute that to other communities for infrastructure or for other kind of programs like social programs. So that's the general theory or logic underpinning land value capture. There are a variety of ways that it can manifest, different mechanisms that you can use. You can, for instance, create a special tax district. In the United States, it's very common to have things like tax increment financing districts, TIFs. Those have partially gone out of fashion a little bit, including California, which is actually where they came from. They're now banned. But Chicago, for instance, has a lot of TIFs. They're very popular. So what you do is you go in, you create a tax increment financing district. You make investments in that area, and all the additional revenue from when you created that gets captured into that district and reinvested in that district for the life of the TIF. So you can create special districts like that. You can create things like one-time impact fees. In Singapore, they have a development tax where if Singapore goes in and creates some sort of investment, infrastructure investment, 50% of the land value increase is captured immediately by the public sector and reinvested elsewhere for infrastructure. So a variety of different ways you can do it. Hong Kong might be the most famous example. MTR, which manages their transportation system there, actually owns the land above the stations and adjacent to the stations and leases that out and makes a significant amount of income. Last time I checked, I'm not sure if this is still true, they were the only major city transportation company that actually made a profit, and that was primarily due to the income that was coming from those leases rather than any sort of money that was coming from the fare collection. There are other things you can do, like density bonuses, things like that, where you give a developer is able to build higher than the otherwise would be able to if they make public investments in their area, or just give a fee to the local government. So now that we've established what land value capture is, there are some conditions that are necessary for it to be appropriate. And LVCs have mostly been used in North America and East Asia, places that have a lot of capacity to do this. They're much less used in developed countries. And where they have been used in developed countries, it tends to be middle-income countries with some more capacity. But the factors that are usually necessary for land value capture to be appropriate, or at least to be possible, is you need reasonably well-established and efficient local land markets with established land tenure and a comprehensive land registry. Additionally, you need institutions like courts and a legal framework that supports property rights. You need a capable tax administration with the appropriate skill and authority to collect and administer those taxes. You need support from the national government with clear policies and expectations, and the local authority to actually enact the policy. So if you have a highly centralized government, national government, local governments can't really enact their own policies related to taxes. It's usually not a very good fit. Other things you need, a transparent governance as well as transparency in the real estate markets. If it's not a very transparent or efficient real estate market, it's not usually a good fit. Sophisticated planning capacity at the local level to manage those funds and redistribute them or reinvest those funds. You also need an empowered and incentivized private sector that's balanced against a competent public sector, right? You need those two forces to sort of be working together in sort of a quasi-public-private partnership. And the last thing I'd mention is you need some protections for equity. So if you're making an investment in a community and the property values go through the roof, for instance, if you make a transportation investment and people get priced out that were living there previously, that's not necessarily the best thing from an equitable development perspective. So you need some sort of protections or forethought put into place to manage for those repercussions of the investment. So last couple things I'll say is a few examples of where it has been tried in various different ways in middle-income countries. In Ethiopia, all land is technically publicly owned and it's leased out. People pay for those leases one time up front, and about 90%, according to the law, 90% of that fee has to be used for public investment. Now, that's not always the case, so there's a lot of criticisms to the policy, but in the law, 90% of the fee for leasing of public lands has to be reinvested in that area or nearby for public investment. The Delhi Metro, which recently did a large expansion, had a system where they invested in public plazas around new transit stations, and they were able to directly capture a lot of the additional revenue from the land, the increase in the land value around those stations. They used that to invest in other improvements throughout the system, lowering the fares or at least keeping them stable while costs raised, and expanding some of the equity provisions that they had for transportation access. And the last example I'll give is not transportation focused, because if you've noticed, there's kind of a theme. Land value capture is almost exclusively used for transportation expansion for a variety of reasons we can get into in a few minutes. But in Casablanca, Morocco, about a third of the cost for expanding their water system and for their floodwater management system came from development fees that were levied on new development as the city was expanding. So developers would pay about, it ranged approximately 1%, depending on the type of housing, whether it was for low income or luxury housing. Luxury housing paid more, but they pay a portion of the sale of the home to the government to expand the network to that area. So it can be done for non-transportation projects, it's just a lot rarer. And the very last things I'll mention is two broader benefits of land value capture. One is that it can tie into broader reforms for tax administration, for public policy and governance. So if you're able to raise revenue in a very transparent way and demonstrate how it's being reinvested in certain communities, that reinforces certain reforms that are underway in many different cities. And the second is it creates a direct link between the taxation and the investment, and it creates a sense of buy-in and a culture of paying for the services that are being expanded to certain communities. And I will stop there.
Thanks, Todd.
So I will be talking about impact bonds. Raise your hand if you've heard of impact bonds. Keep your hand up if you understand how they work. Okay, so maybe a third. So I'm going to be talking about social and development impact bonds. It's a little primer on how they work for those of you who don't know how they work or haven't understood. So usually I describe impact bonds as a marriage between impact investing, a public-private partnership, and results-based financing. So they're a type of results-based financing or payment by results. The way they work is that an investor, usually an impact investor, provides upfront capital to a service provider, most often a nonprofit or NGO. And then that service provider delivers services, and an independent evaluator or an auditor audits or evaluates whether or not an agreed upon set of outcomes have been achieved. And if those outcomes have been achieved, then the so-called outcome funder pays the investor back their principal plus some return. In the case of a social impact bond, the outcome funder is a government, and that can be any level of government. In the case of a development impact bond, which tends to be used in a developing country context, it's a bit of a strange definition. But in the case of a developing, so they are used, the term development impact bond is used in developing country context, but the key difference between development impact bonds and social impact bonds is that the outcome funders, in the case of a development impact bond, are a third party, such as a donor agency like the World Bank, USAID, or a foundation. They aren't bonds, so terrible name. US, it's called Pay for Success Financing. Australia is called social benefit bond. In Sweden, they're called outcomes contracts. So, but the idea is paying for outcomes. How is this different from traditional grants? Generally, traditional grants are based on inputs, so compliance with delivering a set of inputs, and so the idea is really shifting the focus to outcomes. Impact bonds differ from traditional results-based financing in that the party that's holding the risk, for whom the payment is contingent, is this external investor, as opposed to the service providers or a government. So, there may be results-based financing from the World Bank to a donor, to a recipient government, for example. They're the ones who are holding the risk in that case, or in the case where service providers could also be holding that risk. If they don't deliver outcomes, then they take the financial risk. In the case of an impact bond, these service providers hold reputational risk, obviously, because if they don't deliver the outcomes, they don't look good. So that's how an impact bond works. So we've been researching impact bonds for the last 4 years at Brookings. They started, the first impact bond was contracted in the UK in 2010. 3 years ago, we published a report which looked at the first 5 years of impact bonds, and that was 38 impact bonds. So in the last 3 years, the impact bond market has grown substantially, although I'm not sure what the benchmark would be if 129 is a lot or not, but from then to now, definitely impact bond market has grown. That's 129 across 27 countries globally. 10 of those are in developing countries, and of those 10, 3 are social impact bonds, and 7 are development impact bonds. So you can see that in a developing country, you can also have a social impact bond. So it's not, the concept of development impact bond doesn't, it does not restrict, or social impact bonds are not restricted to high-income countries, in that governments who are able, and generally that's middle-income countries, can be the outcome funder. The UK is has contracted the most with 52 impact bonds, the US with 20. The majority of impact bonds have been in the employment sector globally. The majority of those are in high-income countries, followed by social welfare, and that includes homelessness, child welfare programs. In developing country contexts, besides the 10 that have been contracted, there are about 20 that are in development, or that are in the works, and the majority of those are in the health sector, and the majority in Africa. I can maybe give a couple examples later of some impact bonds in developing country contexts. Maybe I can just touch briefly on sort of what we identify as sort of the potential and limitations of impact bonds. So when we started researching impact bonds, we identified in the sort of gray literature what was being written about impact bonds, what we called the 10 common claims about impact bonds. And we looked across all of the impact bonds that had been contracted, and we tried to analyze whether or not these 10 common claims could be demonstrated somehow. We've continued to follow the impact bond market, and continue to, to think about and observe, analyze whether or not we're seeing these things. So what we have seen is what we see as the potential of impact bonds, or where there's some demonstrated evidence, is one, that they're shifting the focus to outcomes. So really this change in the focus from, paying for inputs to paying for outcomes, even more outcomes than traditional results-based financing. So they tend to be focused a bit more on outputs, although impact bonds are also looking at outputs, but more on the outcome side than traditional results-based financing, and definitely more than traditional grants. We see that they are, because outcomes are being measured, these service providers really need to have systems of monitoring and evaluation. And so, we see that it's building a culture of monitoring and evaluation, and thereby also driving performance management. So this idea of sort of these service providers have the flexibility to figure out what's working and what's not working, collect data, analyze the data, and then course adjust. We see that the majority of impact bonds invest in prevention, so preventive interventions. And this last one, reduce risks for governments. So this is one that I always sort of say, in our first analysis, actually, that was in the second category of lacking evidence. And we can talk more about what evidence means, but there's only one impact bond that actually didn't fully pay out, and that was in the US. So in that case, it reduced the risk for government because they didn't pay for outcomes that weren't achieved. For all of the rest of the impact bonds, even for those that have achieved outcomes, we don't know what the counterfactual is, so we don't know if they actually did reduce the risk for government, because maybe those outcomes would have been achieved in the absence of the impact bond anyway. But generally, you can say, okay, governments are paying for outcomes as opposed to paying for stuff that they don't know, that they paying for things that aren't achieving outcomes or not knowing. In terms of where we are sort of lacking evidence, or something that a couple quibbles, I guess, that we have. So one thing is that there's a lot of talk about impact bonds really crowding in private funding. And our sort of analysis of that is, yes, you have impact investors that are engaging, and perhaps they're engaging in sectors that they wouldn't have otherwise, or they're engaging more. But at the end of the day, those impact investors generally are getting paid back and a return on their investment. So it's not necessarily additional funding, unless there are, unless there are potentially, the government is more efficient, and we can talk a little bit more about that, but kind of this idea of bringing in a whole bunch of new private capital is, I feel, not quite fair. In terms of achieving scale, most impact bonds are pretty small, so most of them are serving less than 500 individuals. We now have some much larger impact bonds, and those are generally in developing countries. One in DC is actually the largest, but it measures the entire population of DC, and it's actually about water. And I'm not sure if that's fair either, to include that sort of in the bunch. The other thing is there was a lot of talk about impact bonds supporting experimental interventions. So this is a way to try out things that haven't been tested, et cetera. Generally, what we've seen is that the majority of the impact bonds are actually supporting interventions that have been tested, because the investors are fairly risk averse. I mean, they are impact investors, so they're looking for impact, but they're not super experimental interventions. They may be experimental in that they may be addressing a population that they haven't fully addressed, or they haven't been working at a larger scale, but generally there's evidence behind these interventions. Finally, are they sustaining impact? This one, I might start to shift it up to the, it's a little early to say whether or not there's impact that's being sustained, but we do see in some cases, and I'll talk more about sort of the sustainability, the concept of sustainability in the context of impact bonds, but we do see a few things where, for example, in the state of Utah, after having implemented an impact bond for pre-K, their preschool was made universal across the state. So, those are kinds of things that are happening at a kind of a broader policy level. There are other impact bonds in the Netherlands, for example, that have been replicated and are reaching, greater populations, et cetera. I'd like to talk about sustainability, but we can come back to that one. Yeah. So I'll pause there.
Yeah. All right, Josh. Can you hear everybody in the back? Okay, thanks.
Hi. Thank you for organizing this panel. I'm happy to be here. I apologize for my voice. I'm working through a cold, so apologize for that in advance. And I'm here to talk a little bit about advanced market commitments in the area of global health, and perhaps we'll go beyond that in our discussion. It's a fairly complicated mechanism to describe in 2 minutes, but I'll do my best. So it might be best to start with the problem that this is trying to solve, and that essentially is that we know that the current system for research and development and for increasing access to life-saving medications, drugs, and vaccines does not serve poor populations. Market incentives are the main driver for investments in research and development, and so pharma companies are profit-driven when they make those decisions about where they invest their money for research and development and for ramping up production. So there's little incentive for these companies to invest in interventions that are mostly or wholly focused on poor populations, to put it crudely. So the AMC, the Advanced Market Commitment Contract, was meant to address at least part of this issue and be able to deliver those products to markets which previously didn't provide the incentives to do so. It was put on the map in 2005 by a report from the Center for Global Development, funded by the Gates Foundation. And the authors made the argument that if you put forward a binding commitment, a legally binding commitment with money supported by donors, basically the public sector and private donors, you could set up a system where you would have the incentives for a private pharmaceutical company to invest in research and development or scale up of existing products for the use in low and middle income countries. When this idea came to light, it was thought that it would be applicable to a broad variety of different products in the R&D pipeline and extend back into early research and development. What we've seen is that that's not been the case, and the pneumococcal AMC, which is the largest and really the first AMC out there, was set up to as a pilot test to bring to market existing vaccines, pretty much. So it didn't reach too far back in that pipeline, but I'll get to what it has done in a little bit. So this AMC is a binding commitment from the donors to purchase the pneumococcal vaccine from manufacturers if their product meets certain a product profile for effectiveness and for the types of pneumococcal disease that it covers. So the contracts lay out specified characteristics for the vaccines. They provide a maximum price that the producers can charge, and essentially set up a minimum volume of purchase for the vaccines. So it serves to de-risk the decision from these companies to expand their product into other markets. And the four main objectives for the AMC when it was launched were these: to accelerate the development of new pneumococcal vaccine products. So there were 2 ready to go with others in the pipeline. So hopefully the idea was that it would hopefully push those forward. The second objective was to increase the availability of the existing products, so scale up the production of those ones that already did exist, and to increase the uptake of pneumococcal vaccines in countries which weren't using them, particularly low and middle income countries. And then finally to test this idea of the mechanism of an AMC and see if it worked. So this eventually came to fruition in 2010 is when they started delivering the first vaccines to Honduras. It is backed by a group of donors, and those are Canada, Italy, Norway, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the Gates Foundation, which collectively pledged $1.5 billion in support of the implementation of the AMC over 10 years. And the actors that are involved in it are the Gavi Alliance, the Vaccine Alliance, which is a financing mechanism for supporting the implementation of vaccines in low and middle income countries. The World Bank, which serves as the fiduciary agent, basically oversees the funding piece of this, and UNICEF, which is involved in actually purchasing the pneumococcal and supplying the vaccines where there is a demand for them. So currently there are 2 pharma companies which have agreed to the terms set up in the AMC, and those are Pfizer and GlaxoSmithKline, so 2 large pharmaceutical companies which already had these products ready to go. Something like 700 million doses of the vaccine have been supplied already. 58 countries have been deemed eligible by Gavi for support, and these are the countries. It's been scaled up over time. So the most recent year, for 2017, they estimate about 170 or 180 million doses were delivered under this mechanism. Gavi estimates that the use of the pneumococcal vaccine in Gavi-supported countries will save, looking forward, more than 650,000 children's lives. So if you look at the $1.5 billion investment, crudely, that's about $2,300 per life saved for this mechanism. So without getting into more details about it, and it is fairly complex to talk about, but some takeaways that I take from this is that this is a donor-driven mechanism. I mean, the donors put up the money for the AMC and are really behind the financing and the implementation of this. If they weren't there, then it's not like the private sector would step in. In fact, it's meant to incentivize the private sector to do something which it didn't want to do. For the 4 objectives which I listed for the AMC at its outset, really the only good evidence that we have for success has been on that 3rd point, which is the increased uptake in countries where it might not have been taken up already. And that is fairly clear. So if you compare it to other vaccines which have been introduced, hepatitis B and other examples, the uptake for pneumococcal vaccine has been faster. And it's hard to ascribe a complete cause and effect there, but it seems clear that it has had a pretty important effect of getting these vaccines into these countries more quickly than they would have been. And the AMC has kept the price lower than it would have been. And again, we can compare to other vaccines out there like hepatitis B, where after their introduction, the prices were quite high, even in low and middle income countries. So I'll stop there. I can say that in the global health field, there is a whole host of activities around innovative financing mechanisms, and I just borrowed this slide from the USAID report. There's a Center for Accelerating Impact and Innovation at USAID in the Global Health Bureau, focused specifically on using these non-traditional financing tools. So we can talk about some of these if we want to, and we've already talked about the development impact bonds. You know, it's a fertile territory in global health, certainly, and I think a lot of sectors do look to global health as one of the innovators and a sector which uses these types of mechanisms quite well, including Unitaid, right? Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm going to just ask a bunch of questions, and I'm hoping that everybody will jump in and answer those questions so that it's not a Q&A on one-on-one. So I'm going to start with you, Chloe, because in terms of understanding, and anybody feel free to disagree with me, it seemed that solidarity levies were the most straightforward, simple to understand mechanism that's out there. You know, you've got a transaction, you put a tax on it, you put it all together. So what about it, essentially, do you think has allowed it to grow to the extent that it has and be this force for Unitaid? And has it changed the way in which the money is spent, not just the way in which the money is raised? So one, and then two, what's sort of what was the role of the government of France? I mean, what is sort of the trigger for getting this in place and then supported year upon year upon year?
Great. So I think in terms of Unitaid's growth, one of the things that has allowed it to be successful is that the airline industry was kind of, it was a good pick for what should be levied. The president of France, which I'll get to in terms of your last question, really pushed this through in 2006. It was kind of his dream to see this come through. Innovative financing still wasn't really a thing at that point. He initially wanted to do a financial transaction tax, which I'm happy to talk about, but is a bit more controversial and difficult to push through. That would be taxes on stocks, bonds, derivatives. And when he saw that that wasn't really going to happen, he started looking at other ideas, hired some economists, and looked at the airline industry, which is very inelastic, so consumers don't change their preferences, and has a whole other host of reasons why it's a good industry to be levied. And he actually managed to get eventually the airline industry and many consumers on board in terms of how they were thinking about this. Air France actually now kind of promotes it, and I think him, I guess now I'm just really answering question 3, but him kind of taking control of that and getting other countries on board and figuring out which industry made sense to be taxed was what has allowed it to expand. And now, I mean, once it was put into place, it kind of was just a snowball mechanism from there. Other countries saw that it was effective, saw that it wasn't negatively impacting France's airline industry. There really hasn't been any sort of distortion in terms of how consumers are purchasing their flight prices. And so other countries have slowly kind of come on board, and not much has had to be done since then because the mechanism's just naturally in place. In terms of the way that the money is spent, so I mean, a solidarity levy is more of a source of funds as opposed to a mechanism, but the way that the actual organization Unitaid functions is that the funds come in, and then there's kind of a typical grant proposal process. And so large organizations like the Clinton Initiative, I'm blanking on the name, but they'll propose a project, and Unitaid really emphasizes innovation. So they want this to be something that's making a huge change. It can't just be like a minimal change. It needs to really affect the way that people are able to obtain health services. And then it does the typical impact evaluation process. And so I think the bigger change is how the amount of funds that it's been able to generate and the sustainability of those funds as opposed to kind of the disbursement of those funds.
Got it. So just to carry on that kind of line of questioning to this point of leadership, I just want to go to Josh, when you said that, you know, AMCs are still donor-driven and they were trying to figure out this market failure, but they stepped in, donors stepped in, essentially the market is still failing. The private sector just hasn't changed the way in which it does its business. Is there any sort of danger at some point that the private sector reneges on its contracts when it makes them? And what conditions would those happen under?
Well, sure. I mean, there's always a risk there. And I think you may be hinting at something that has just occurred or recently occurred. Not under the AMC, but under an agreement, separate agreement with Gavi, the pharmaceutical company Merck, which had agreed to supply a rotavirus vaccine for 4 West African countries for 6 years, basically announced that they would not be doing that. So they were going to reduce their supply for the last 2 years, over the next 2 years, cut it by a third and then a third again, and then stop supplying this vaccine at the low price that they had agreed to. Essentially what they are doing is switching their target market from these West African countries to China. And so in April this year, they received the go-ahead from the Chinese government to market their vaccine, this rotavirus vaccine, in China. And so the thinking is, well, this was something that, clearly a market incentive from their part, so where they were charging on the order of $2 to $3 in West Africa to Gavi. They can charge $40 or more in the Chinese market. So that market incentive is always going to be a strong pull, and an agreement. Now the AMC is maybe different in that it's a legally binding agreement rather than this sort of handshake or not as legally binding agreement that they made with Gavi to produce for these West African countries. So that's a risk that's out there, right? And so, when I think about the AMC and whether it can be replicated for other even health products, it's hard to know where you could plug this mechanism in. Although one other example where we have seen it successfully used on a much smaller scale is with the Ebola vaccine. So after the 2014 West Africa epidemic, we saw the rapid research development of an effective Ebola vaccine. Now that is still under investigational use or emergency use only. But what Gavi did was basically set up an AMC for the Ebola vaccine to get 200,000 doses ready to go. This was in 2016. Without knowing that they were going to have another large outbreak, with the expectation there would be another large outbreak. But now that we have this current outbreak going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo, right, their largest outbreak to date, and they've had 10. So over 330 cases at this point. It's amazing that they had these vaccines pre-positioned and ready to do it partly because of this agreement, and they've now successfully vaccinated over 30,000 people in a war zone, which is unbelievable. So anyway, there are uses where this can be plugged in, but there's always going to be a risk, yes,
Off the market, right.
of the market dictating what we do.
Yeah. Is there? So I could ask you more questions about the AMCs. I just find them incredibly, just truly one of the. We will get to one. I have two questions to both of you as well, just getting off sort of the role of the private sector. So, Matt, you've already outlined why LVCs do or don't work, land markets, et cetera, et cetera. So can you think of a way in which land value capture and that kind of a mechanism can be applied in a setting, the kinds of settings that we studied with developing country settings, where you don't have those cadastral markets set up, your land markets are not regulated fairly well, municipal authorities are not terribly transparent. Is there a way to not just raise that money, but also to get governments to spend it better because you're raising it in that particular way? Is there something about the mechanism that creates incentives to spend it better?
Yes, I would say that it's very difficult to apply. So all the examples were not just transportation focused, they were also middle income country focused, because it requires a great deal of local administrative capacity, a degree of decentralization of certain powers to the local level. And as you mentioned, land markets that are well regulated, that are transparent, and that, first of all, exists. There's land tenure that exists, and clear guidelines for that. The mechanism itself does offer the benefit, to your last point of your question, of sort of leading to better outcomes, because it sort of encourages a transparent transactional relationship between local landowners, shops, anyone who's paying the additional fee, and the services they're getting back for that in terms of the quality of the infrastructure that's already been built, that there are additional taxes paying for, or any future investment that's being made into the community. I think it's very difficult to do land value capture in places where there isn't clear land tenure. I think it can be an incentive, and it can be something to work towards for communities that don't have land tenure currently in place, or don't have strong institutions, and don't have local administrative capacity. It certainly can go hand in hand with reforms. It's just harder to do unless you have that. At a very basic level, land value capture is property tax. I mean, right? So it's sort of like
property improvement tax.
It's property improvement tax. Yeah, it's property improvement tax.
Yeah.
And so it's a very basic way of raising revenue, but in many places the capacity, the infrastructure just isn't there to actually do it in a way that's transparent and fair.
Okay. Yes, we do have questions. I'm going to ask the last question to Emily, and then I'm going to open it up for everybody to. So Emily, I think that what I took away from your presentation was SIBs are interesting, and perhaps they might help us reach certain kinds of populations or scale up certain kinds of issues, but let's not get really overexcited about them. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think the starting point is really, like you said, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And, using, so SIBs and DIBs are a mechanism that potentially address the quality issue or achievement of outcomes, right? Or the failure to achieve outcomes. And usually we talk about sort of, they may fit best. So there are, a number of sort of criteria when or where they might or might not be appropriate. But sort of the one question we usually ask is sort of, like for what types of populations or what types of services. And often what we've seen so far and kind of where we're seeing impact bonds perhaps being most appropriate is for services that are sort of, the inputs are fairly complex, but the outcomes are fairly simple to measure. Okay. For services that are, I think, fairly human-centered, so kind of where the state is failing to achieve outcomes among certain populations. So perhaps, non-state actors may be better placed to deliver those services. I think the most important thing, or sort of what we see as impact bonds, are sort of, they're kind of a means, they're means to an end. They're not the end in and of itself. That's sort of I think that they have the potential to improve the entire system in the improvement of monitoring and evaluation, in driving performance management among service providers, in getting outcome funders to really think about the achievement of outcomes as opposed to focusing on the inputs. And sort of, so it's that kind of bigger picture mindset shift that I think impact bonds really have the potential to bring. Do we want to see impact bonds done over and over again to infinitum? I don't think that that's really the answer, and I don't know if they're necessarily the answer, if they're the answer for delivering basic services at scale or at scale, period.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So my very last question to all of you, and then we are going to open it up, is, so there is sort of this big trend, whether it's in health or education or transport, to really look at the inability of the state to deliver services efficiently at the same time as we're talking about improving public financial management, right? So everybody's agreed that public financial management systems have to improve, taxes have to be raised, tariffs have to be covered, et cetera, but the state's not raising sufficient resources right now, and the private sector's pounced and ready to step in. In any of the mechanisms that you've described, do you think that there is a greater role for private capital to come in, and where would that happen? And if we're really looking at the services, basic services, urban infrastructure services, that includes water, sanitation, solid waste, transport, am I missing something? Electricity? I don't think so. Those three, do you think that your mechanisms that you have described have a way of sort of marrying the private sector more usefully in those arenas? And the answer could be no, but just...
I'll say no. Well, for the AMC, I mean, it's really about bringing in a technology that is pre-existing, using a donor mechanism to a market where it might not have been used. So there might be applicability in the water and sanitation and other public service sectors. I don't know that well enough to say, but certainly hard to see how it would achieve the goals that you just outlined.
Yep.
I guess it depends on what your definition of private sector and private capital is. So, so in terms of the investors in this, we're mostly seeing, as I said, impact investors. We're not seeing really commercial capital as of yet, and probably will not due to the limited size, thus far anyway, due to limited size and potentially the risk associated with them. So
are impact investors more likely to go to other ways of impact investing rather than to SIBs, if you were to grow the pot?
Pardon? What
would impact investors?
I mean, I think that impact bonds are, that impact investors are increasingly interested in impact bonds. They are fairly, thus far, and probably still will be, for first-time actors in particular, fairly complex to put together and time-consuming and highly costly from a or maybe perceived at least to be costly from a transactional perspective. There's another argument to that, which is that there are these broader ecosystem effects, and so if you're looking at sort of a cost-benefit analysis of different types of financing mechanisms, you need to also consider that. But I mean, I personally think for impact investors, it's an interesting, impact bonds are interesting because there's a greater focus on measurement, concrete measurement of outcomes, and you know, which the impact investing sector has not been great at thus far. So.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'd say for land value capture, certainly. I mean, it establishes a logical link between the private capital and the public provision of certain goods. So yeah, I mean, I think definitely it's definitely a PPP sort of relationship.
Okay. And
Yeah, I mean, if you consider the funds coming in from the levy as private capital, then I think there's definitely an application for the solidarity levy to the water sector, especially because, I mean, I think that it would take a different form. It would probably go towards funding utilities while they kind of build up their capacity and ability to provide for poorer populations, and it could kind of assist them while they're building their capacity, and then eventually perhaps be removed and be replaced by their own funding mechanisms. But yeah, I definitely see an application there.
okay. All right. So that was sort of where we had ended up also in our own assessment when we had looked at all of these, but we were a little bit more hopeful that a global health kind of a fund that we could put together would work, although we couldn't figure out how exactly it would work for water.
Well, the AMC being one form
One
of a
form
fund,
of the
yes,
funding,
so
right,
there might be
exactly.
many others.
Yeah, yeah. So I know that there were two hands, and I just want to make sure that everybody, so I'm going to start with the student because students get priority, and then we'll go to Louis. Yes.
My question was for Professor Michaud.
Yeah.
Yeah. The AMC, does it have a risk? Does it actually stipulate the vaccine or thereby the company that produces it? I'm wondering if it has sort of a monopolistic effect, whereas the company that's brought into the AMC, that's a legally mandated agreement, therefore then has market primacy if the market starts to grow. So if another group develops a vaccine that actually operates at a cheaper price, prior to that contract being fulfilled, you can't actually switch companies necessarily. So is it company-based, vaccine-based, or are those linked inherently?
Right. Yeah, so what happens in the initial contract is that there's a target product profile, a TPP, and they put that together, which says it has to have certain efficacy, proven efficacy. It has to meet a number of other technical requirements. So in the case of the pneumococcal vaccines, there were already two which met that. The idea was that there would be more which would come on board. So it was kind of both. It was targeted at the existing vaccines, but also hopefully that they would bring in others. There's nothing to say that the AMC, I mean, in fact, it was designed to create competition among pharmaceutical companies to get part of this pie, which was this donor-funded AMC fund, right? We haven't seen that. So the same two companies which started providing these are the same two companies which still provide the vaccines. Now, there are supposed to be other companies. So there's the Serum Institute in India, another Indian pharmaceutical company, which have been approved for, their vaccines have been approved and they meet the target profile. Therefore could be supplying. And I don't know what the bottleneck there is, but they haven't yet joined the AMC. So it's actually meant to be anti-monopolistic, if that explains it.
Thanks, Josh. Louis?
So, general thought, which I shared with you when I looked at this, which is we're looking at you need to be looking here in order to, if you can make the borrower stronger, it will follow. I mean, there's no, the basic principle of finance is there's no free lunch. So all of these mechanisms, or you find people to take more. So but that's just a general. Look at all at what might be called implicit
Manila and Manila water. Mhm.
People thought they eventually had to see it back because they had no
Run it.
Manila water ended up managing from the way the discussion was that there was an implicit and Emily, in looking at the my experience has been probably the
So I'll respond quickly first. I haven't studied that, but I think the challenge, the times that would be a problem is if the entity that is managing those services, if they're attracted to the implicit value of the lands, if they are not held accountable for delivering the core services that are there. So MTR in Hong Kong, for instance, they derive an insane amount of their revenue from the leases, not from revenue from the fare box. I think it's like 80 or 90%. It's very, very, very high. In fact, it's probably too high. But they're still providing the core service, and they're held accountable through local mechanisms to do so. Now, if you have an entity that's there only for the land, has no capacity or ability to actually provide the core service that they're tasked to do, that's certainly an issue. But I think that goes to like the mechanisms for awarding those services in the first place, right? And then holding them accountable through time if you have mechanisms in place. And that goes to the strength of local governance and whatever mechanisms that you have oversight from the national body to ensure that those contracts are being awarded to entities that do have the capacity.
I totally agree with what you said, and that's why Manila was
Yeah.
Taken back.
out because they couldn't perform. But I'm wondering if recognizing that up front is a way of
Raise money.
raise money and to take the risk.
Yeah, I mean, I think entities that are going to be bidding for that would be aware of that to begin with, right? I mean, they're going to be making that calculation, especially if it's a private operator or a quasi-private operator. They're going to be making that calculation like that entity.
I'm just thinking all the conditions you set out
Mm-hmm.
do not exist in most
Sure.
and won't exist for decades.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So,
Figuring out a way to capture it informally.
Sure.
Right.
No, absolutely agree.
Emily, just your, and then I'm going to take another question. So,
Sure. Indeed, that is true. The outcome payers, outcome funders are the hardest to come by, particularly in developing country contexts. Why is that? One, I think it's a little bit difficult to understand the mechanism. I mean, so there's like sort of a lot of education that needs to happen. Two, it's a really new way of doing business, and it can be a little bit daunting. And in fact, it may not be legally possible for some governments or other organizations or donor agencies to pay for outcomes in that way. So in the developing country context, we're talking about either government outcome funders or donor agencies or foundations. Thus far, we've seen foundations. We've seen 3 governments of outcome funders, at least partial outcome funders. The others are other third-party entities. So those are sort of the, kind of the bottlenecks. I mean, we're seeing some increased interest. We've also seen cases where, for example, there were impact bonds that were in the works and very close, and then there were changes in government, and then done. So it's just, I think that those political fluctuations are a really important thing to think about. And new way of doing business, challenging, different, sometimes not possible.
Cinnamon, Professor Dornsipe, and then Jonah. Yeah. Oh, all right. I just saw his hand after yours.
I
Okay.
was wondering about the solidarity levies. You highlighted one industry which you said, was kind of receptive to this and then was able to champion it. I was wondering if you might highlight maybe like a couple other opportunities, because it would seem like there might not be that many industries where demand, as you said, wouldn't be impacted by such a tax.
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, there have been a few other solidarity levies which organizations have tried to implement since the success of UNITAID. One was using, it was kind of a UNICEF partnership with a few African countries, and that was trying to levy oil from the state-owned oil enterprises. The other was on, why am I blanking on what it was?
Water. We put water here.
No, it was the, can I go back to my
Slide.
Sorry.
Let's see.
That one, yeah, thank you. Oh, sorry, the cigarette tax. So a few European countries tried to do a tobacco tax, and that also was not passed through. And so I think I maybe glossed over the fact that, I mean, yes, it's very hard to find an industry and it's hard to get approval for these things. I think we looked at water, given the context of our study, and we think that it's feasible, especially since water is kind of a necessary good. If you did a tax on bottled water in particular, that could kind of directly link funding for water, as well as something that could potentially benefit the environment, getting rid of more plastic from bottled water. You do have to take into consideration that some people, I mean, it is something you need for life, and so you might get complaints then from the other side saying you can't tax something that's necessary for life. Off the top of my head, I mean, the financial transaction tax, people keep throwing the idea around, and France has imposed it in some way that is also kind of a way to reduce or kind of punish people for the financial crisis in terms of risky speculation. And so that is feasible. You just have to figure out exactly what within that industry you're going to tax. So I think, I mean, telecommunications, there's all sorts of possibilities, and you'd have to do kind of an in-depth economic study of the elasticity and of each of those industries. But those are just a few of the ideas that we...
Yeah. To
Yeah.
do the. Yeah.
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 And I would also add, even in DC, the bag tax, plastic bag tax, 5 cent, it's purposely designed to decrease use of bags. I mean, I definitely decrease my use of plastic bags.
And
Yeah.
same with the sugar tax
Yeah.
also.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if we then say
No sugar beverage.
all of these things, and a lot of those taxes don't necessarily have a social, that's just a tax, right? That's just a tax that's either trying to de-incentivize behavior,
Right.
or just raise amorphous funds that could.
Right. There is. Absolutely.
So I do think one of the specific things that I was trying to think about for
Is
this
a levy.
Yeah.
It's a solidarity levy. I mean, the other thing is, why is it called a solidarity levy? Because if you think about it, and I think Chloe talked about this, it's not just one country. Like, it's a lot of different countries, and they've all agreed to come together. And this includes developing countries as well.
And I think, I mean, it's and that's an important distinction to make between just a domestic task and a tax and a solidarity levy, is that it's the magnitude of bringing taxes from multiple countries together, kind of the offsetting. And if one country drops out, you still have other countries that are providing funds for this, so you can offset cash flows. And so there are benefits, and kind of, there's also the skills that come from having an international organization as opposed to just one country that's doing this. So yeah, you have to think of it at an international level, but it is an important distinction to make.
The water effort is being done through the industry, not through the company level.
Yeah.
Both the bottled water organizations and
Yeah. Cinnamon?
This is a question going kind of back to outcome funding.
Uh-huh.
And I was thinking development banks can be the outcome funders. And the innovative financing part of it would be to, once the country delivers on the agreed upon social outcome, that the terms of the loan would be reduced. And so it could be a way of incentivizing good behavior. And I'm just wondering, did you come across any of those kind of thinking along that direction? Because that seems to me to be like an obvious way for a development bank to kind of come in and play both the role of the impact investor and the outcome funder.
So I'll answer that question, but sort of part of that question is also sort of why does this differ in a developing country context versus high-income country context? And part of that is sort of the original idea was that by paying for things up front, you're preventing bad things and costly things from happening down the line. And so in a high-income country context, and sometimes in a middle-income country context, there may be expenditures on, remedial services, which could be monetizable savings. That was talked about a lot in sort of early years of impact bonds. It's shifted a little bit, sort of discussion has shifted a little bit to, this is really about achieving outcomes, but in a developing country context, if those remedial services don't exist, then it's a bit more of a challenge. So that's kind of another aspect. In terms of donor agencies, I think it's a really interesting discussion, and I've been speaking with the World Bank and USAID and DFID and IDB mostly on this for the last several years. I mean, honestly, if I'm a task team leader at the World Bank, my incentive is actually to get more money out the door, right? So that's the first problem. Second is thinking about sort of what is the dynamic between the donor agency and the recipient government, and what the incentives are for them, right? And so again, the risk is shifted from the outcome funder. I think that in the traditional model of the impact bond, if there was some, mechanism by which that, perhaps they're holding part of the risk or something, then that could be different. I think that there are some other interesting cases. There's one impact bond for maternal and newborn health where actually the donor agency, USAID, is the outcome funder the first 3 years, and the government is the outcome funder for years 4 and 5, if success is achieved in years 1 through 3. So that's kind of interesting. There's also, the World Bank. So the World Bank has 3 to 4 impact bonds that are in development currently. Generally, they're tapping into trust funds as opposed to, World Bank. Traditional World Bank lending finance. So anyway, it's a very long discussion and very interesting to think about the incentives.
But there are two that come to mind which combine loans with GPOBAs, which was the output-based aid kind of component, and both of the GPOBAs got withdrawn. One was in Ethiopia and one was, I can't remember, I just read about them. So essentially the loan went through, but the GPOBA component never came through at all, because it was very clear that they were not going to be achieving the outputs that they had intended to, and there was so it worked in the reverse. Yeah,
it's also important to note that the donor agencies also are engaging in other forms of results-based financing through their own mechanisms, et cetera. They're just starting to dabble in impact bonds, but they have been for many years.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So I had 2 questions, a 2-part question. Curious from Emily and Chloe, who do you think are the best positioned champions for some of this? I mean, you spoke a little bit about like the market incentive or something that's donor driven. Also what happens when you have a lot of political capital behind some of these mechanisms. So first of all, do you think that that's the best person to be the champion of some of these efforts? And second, do you ever see a world where the service provider can play a more pivotal role in pushing together some of these mechanisms? Do you think that those particular sectors have the capacity to do some of this work without necessarily the political interplay above coming down trying to impose some of the mechanisms themselves?
It's a very good question. I'll start with the second, I think, and feel free to correct me if this is wrong. In the case of a solidarity levy, I think that it kind of has to come from the national level. I don't think that it can start in the sector level. Perhaps they can suggest it to the head of the country, the government, but I think that that really has to come from the top down. In terms of a specific country, or I mean, I think that given that these generally rest within international organizations, I think that there is room for organizations like the World Bank or UNICEF or the World Health Organization to kind of maybe recommend these to their member countries, and that would reduce, I mean, France really had to push for UNITAID in addition to Brazil and Chile. Those three kind of pushed it through, and maybe if that recommendation came from the international organization, it could create more cohesion in terms of multiple countries pushing it through as opposed to one having to champion it. But I do think it's a kind of a national level.
So there are some initiatives sort of looking at growing impact bonds and size and or scale really, and it's sort of interesting to observe how that's happening. I mean, some of that's coming from either a sector champion. So in the case of education, there are these two $1 billion outcome funds for education that are in development, which are sort of being backed by Gordon Brown, who's the UN Special Envoy on Education, which is sort of interesting, as well as Sir Ronald Cohen, who's kind of the godfather of impact investing. I personally think that this really, that governments really should be the drivers of you know, in the desire to achieve outcomes and to not be paying for things that aren't working. And I think that that's the more sustainable sort of solution. I mean, I don't think that there should be necessarily champions for impact bonds. There should be champions for the achievement of outcomes, however you get there.
Yeah.
So the second question was?
No, that pretty much answered.
Yeah,
both
maybe
of
that
them
answers.
together.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've just got sort of this very stalwart crowd left here who must really be interested because classes are going to start soon. So I'd just like to take 2 seconds to thank all of you for coming and having this conversation with all of us. And thanks again for sharing your time and your expertise. Thanks.
Thank you.